The autumn sun cast long copper shadows across the wind-swept plains of Perdition Valley, illuminating the hand-carved sign of the Golden Horseshoe Saloon like a final beacon before darkness claimed the land. The establishment teetered on the edge of civilization in the scattered settlement of Salvation's End, a town too small to merit proper placement on territorial maps, but substantial enough to draw those who preferred to operate beyond the reach of formal law. And on this particular evening, as dust devils danced in the dying light, death itself had come calling, wearing a gentleman's smile and carrying a bounty hunter's determination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Madeline Thorne pushed through the saloon's weather-beaten doors, the hinges protesting with a mournful creak that somehow cut through the raucous din inside. Though the noise didn't immediately subside, a ripple of awareness spread through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Conversations faltered, glasses paused mid-air, and wary glances skittered toward the entrance. She wasn't particularly imposing. A woman in her mid-30s with copper-streaked chestnut hair pulled back beneath a practical dark hat, her face bearing the subtle weathering of someone who'd spent years beneath the harsh prairie sun. Her indigo riding dress had once been fine, but now showed signs of practical mending, though it remained meticulously clean. A leather vest hugged her frame, its multiple small pockets suggesting utility rather than ornament. Most striking, however, was the custom gun belt that hung low on her hips, its tooled leather worn to butter softness in places. The twin revolvers nestled in their holsters seemed incongruous against her otherwise unassuming appearance. Precision instruments of death carried by hands that looked equally capable of tending wounds or kneading bread. 28 pairs of eyes tracked her movement as she crossed the threshold. The Golden Horseshoe had been a cacophony of tinny piano notes, drunken boasts, and gambling disputes mere seconds before. Now the only sounds were the soft fall of Madeline's boots against the sawdust-strewn floorboards, and the occasional nervous clink of glass against wood as someone set down their drink with unsteady hands. Madeline's gaze moved methodically across the room, cataloguing faces and postures with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to identify threats before they fully materialized. Her eyes, an unusual shade of amber flecked with grey, moved from table to table, noting each hand that instinctively twitched toward a weapon before reconsidering. The saloon's patrons presented a patchwork of frontier life. Local shopkeepers, seeking escape from daily tedium, trail-worn cowboys, spending their wages before the dust of the drive had settled from their clothes, traveling gamblers with calculating eyes, and a particular group that had claimed the largest table near the center of the room. 9 men sat there, their clothing finer than most, their laughter louder than necessary, their presence exerting a gravity that had pushed other customers to the periphery. At their center sat Everett Bishop, a man whose infamous reputation had preceded him to Salvation's End by at least a fortnight. Leader of the notorious Bishop Boys, he had built his name through stagecoach robberies, cattle-field conquest, and an ever-growing list of bodies left in unmarked graves across 3 territories. Bishop's auburn hair was slicked back beneath an immaculate black hat adorned with a silver band. His moustache and short beard were precisely trimmed, framing a smile that never quite reached his amber eyes. His burgundy brocade vest glinted with silver threads that caught the lamplight with each casual movement. A heavy silver watch chain draped across his middle, a timepiece reportedly taken from a railroad executive whose train he'd robbed the previous spring. Madeline made her way to the bar, each step measured, her posture erect despite the palpable tension that followed her. Like a shadow, she seemed not to notice the stares, showed no reaction to the quiet that had fallen over the usually boisterous establishment. Whiskey she said to the barkeeper, her voice soft but carrying a clarity that suggested she rarely needed to repeat herself. Just one. The bartender, a broad-shouldered man called Silas Pell, who had poured drinks in Salvation's End since the town consisted of little more than tents and ambition, hesitated only momentarily before reaching for a bottle on the shelf behind him. He placed a glass before her, the amber liquid catching the lamplight as he poured with practiced precision. "Passing through, ma'am?" Silas asked, keeping his voice low, his fingers lingering on the glass as if reluctant to complete the transaction. Madeline's lips curved slightly, though the expression held more resolve than mirth. "No, Mr. Pell. I'm here to stay." Those 5 simple words, spoken with quiet certainty, carried across the suddenly hushed room. Everett Bishop paused mid-anecdote, his head turning toward the bar with the deliberate focus of a predator catching an unfamiliar scent. "Well now," he drawled, pushing back his chair and standing with theatrical ease. "That's mighty interesting, because I've been spending considerable time in this fine establishment for nearly a week, and I don't believe I've had the pleasure." Madeline didn't turn immediately. She lifted the glass to her lips, took a measured sip, and set it down with the careful precision that characterized all her movements before acknowledging Bishop's comment. "I've been occupied," she said simply, finally turning to face him directly, "burying my husband." Something flickered across Bishop's face, not sympathy, certainly not remorse, but a momentary recalibration. He recovered swiftly, offering an elaborate bow that drew appreciative chuckles from his companions. "My sincere condolences, ma'am," he said, each word dripping with false courtesy. "Losing a husband must be a terrible burden for a lady to bear alone in such unforgiving country." The saloon had grown so quiet that the soft creak of floorboards beneath shifting boots seemed unnaturally loud. The locals, those who had lived in Salvation's End long enough to recognize both Madeline and the man she had laid to rest 2 days prior, began edging toward the exits, their expressions tight, with the foreknowledge of what might follow. "It's a burden I shoulder adequately," Madeline replied, her tone unchanged, betraying neither offense nor appreciation for his performative sympathy. "Though I'd prefer to bear it without interruption." Bishop exchanged glances with his men, his smile widening to reveal teeth too perfect for a man who had spent most of his life on the frontier. He approached the bar with exaggerated casualness, his silver spurs creating a rhythmic chime with each step, a sound that seemed purposefully designed to grate against already frayed nerves. "Peace is a rare commodity these days," he mused, stopping. Close enough that Madeline could detect the mingled scents of tobacco, whiskey, and bay rum, especially for a widow woman all alone. He gestured expansively around the saloon. "This territory doesn't show much kindness to those without protection." Madeline took another unhurried sip of her whiskey. "And I suppose you're offering protection?" Bishop laughed, the sound sharp enough to make several patrons flinch, perceptive as well as beautiful. "I like that in a woman." He leaned against the bar, positioning himself between Madeline and the door. "As it happens, my associates and I have taken an interest in ensuring the safety of this promising settlement, for a reasonable contribution, of course." Silas Pell had gone very still behind the bar, his hands no longer polishing glasses, his knuckles white around the edge of the wooden counter. Outside, the sunset had deepened to purple, throwing lengthening shadows across the saloon floor as the last golden light retreated. "Thorn Station doesn't require your particular brand of security," Madeline said, setting her glass down with the finality of someone concluding business. For a moment, Bishop's smile faltered, the practiced charm slipping to reveal something colder and more calculating beneath. Then he threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing off the rafters. "Thorn Station," he repeated, turning to his men with theatrical incredulity. "Boys, did you hear that? This little lady thinks she can manage Thorn Station all by her lonesome." His men obliged with dutiful laughter. though several exchanged glances with expressions that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with the direction this was taking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The Thorne name carried significant weight across the territory, or it had before Marcus Thorne's death 3 days prior. The station encompassed one of the largest cattle operations for 100 miles, controlling critical water access that had become increasingly valuable during the ongoing drought. "I don't think," Madeline corrected him, her voice still measured, despite the growing tension. "I know." Bishop's amusement vanished like morning dew under a harsh sun. He straightened, squaring his shoulders, no longer bothering with the veneer of civility. "A woman has no business running an operation that size," he stated flatly. "Sooner or later, you'll come to your senses and sell. Only question is whether you'll get a fair price or something considerably less generous." Madeline finished her whiskey in a single swallow, set the glass down and stood. She was nearly a full head shorter than Bishop, but something in her posture, a stillness that came not from fear but from absolute control, made the difference seem inconsequential. "Mr. Bishop," she said, using his name for the first time, confirming what he had suspected, that she knew precisely who he was. "I'm not selling Thorne Station. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." She reached into her pocket and placed a coin on the bar for her drink. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have pressing matters to attend to." She moved to step around him, but found Bishop shifting to block her path. His smile had returned, but it no longer contained even the pretense of warmth. "I don't think you understand how this works, Mrs. Thorne," he said, dropping his voice to a near whisper. "You see, I've already made arrangements with the bank in Prosperity Junction. Your husband left significant debts behind, and they're coming due rather rapidly. It was a lie, and both of them knew it. Marcus Thorne had been many things: stubborn, occasionally reckless, fiercely independent, but never a man who couldn't honor his obligations. Still, banks could be persuaded to reconsider loan terms, especially when influence and money exchanged hands beneath the table." "Curious," Madeline replied. "Mr. Donovan at the bank assured me just yesterday that all our accounts remain in excellent standing." She met his gaze directly. "Perhaps you should verify your information." A muscle twitched in Bishop's jaw, the only sign that her response had unsettled him. One of his men, a tall figure with a prominent scar running from left temple, the jawline, stood and approached, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his side. "Everything all right, Everett?" he asked, his voice carrying a rasp like metal dragged across stone, his eyes never leaving Madeline's face. "Just fine, Hollis," Bishop answered, his gaze still locked with Madeline's. "Mrs. Thorne and I are having a civilized discussion about her future." "My future is not open for negotiation," Madeline stated firmly, stepping to the side once more, only to find Hollis now blocking her path as well. The atmosphere in the saloon had grown suffocating with tension. The few remaining patrons were frozen in place, unwilling to leave, but equally unwilling to intervene. Silas Pell had disappeared beneath the bar, perhaps reaching for the shotgun he kept mounted below the counter. "I think it is," Bishop countered, his voice hardening. "You see, I've taken a particular interest in your property. That water access alone is worth triple what the land and cattle are worth in this drought." His smile twisted into something uglier. "I'm prepared to be generous, given your situation, Mrs. Thorne, but my generosity has limits. Before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're enjoying this tale of courage against impossible odds, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more stories like this one. I've saved something truly special for tomorrow that you won't want to miss. Now back to Madeline's showdown." Madeline's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in her eyes. A fleeting calculation, the barest narrowing that suggested she was reassessing her options. "I'd advise you to step aside, Mr. Bishop," she said calmly. "I've had a trying few days, and I have no desire to extend them further with this pointless conversation." Bishop snorted, glancing at Hollis with exaggerated astonishment. "Do you hear that, Hollis? The widow's giving me orders in my own establishment." "Last I checked," Madeline corrected him, "Silas Pell owned the Golden Horseshoe." "Ownership is such a fluid concept," Bishop replied with a dismissive wave. "Silas and I have come to an understanding about certain business matters, haven't we, Silas?" From beneath the bar came a grudging grunt that might have been agreement or might have been resignation. "Now," Bishop continued, turning his attention back to Madeline, "I think it's time we discussed your situation like reasonable adults. My offer won't remain open indefinitely, and believe me when I say you won't appreciate the alternatives." Madeline's hand moved beneath her vest, quick and fluid. The metallic click of a revolver being cocked echoed through the silent saloon like a thunderclap. For several heartbeats no one moved. Then Bishop's face split into a grin, and he erupted into laughter, his men joining in a moment later. "Wood. You look at that, boys," he exclaimed between guffaws. "The widow thinks she's a gunslinger." Hollis chuckled, shaking his head as if witnessing the antics of a child. "Careful with that hardware, ma'am. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." Madeline didn't flinch at their mockery. The revolver remained steady in her hand, its barrel deliberately pointed at the ceiling rather than at any person, a warning rather than an immediate threat. "This is your final warning," she said, her voice calm despite the escalation. "Step aside." Bishop wiped at his eyes, his laughter subsiding into occasional chuckles. "Or what? You'll ventilate my hat? Come now, Mrs. Thorne, we both know you're not the type." Without shifting her gaze from Bishop, Madeline adjusted her aim slightly and fired. The shot cracked through the saloon, deafening in the enclosed space. A bottle on the top shelf behind the bar exploded in a shower of glass and amber liquid, precisely the rare Kentucky bourbon Bishop had been drinking all evening. In the ringing silence that followed, Madeline's voice was soft but perfectly audible. "That was a warning, Mr. Bishop. The next one won't be aimed at glassware." Bishop's jovial expression had vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. He studied Madeline as if seeing her for the first time, not as an obstacle to be brushed aside, but as a potential threat to be eliminated. "You've made a serious mistake," he said quietly, all pretense gone from his voice. Madeline met his gaze, unflinchingly. "The only mistake would be continuing to stand in my way." For a long moment they stood in tableau, the widow with her smoking gun, the outlaw with his hand hovering near his holster, the crowded room holding its collective breath. Then, with deliberate slowness, Bishop stepped aside. "This isn't over," he promised, his voice low enough that only Madeline could hear him. "No," she agreed, moving past him toward the door, her revolver still drawn. "It isn't." She backed out of the saloon, keeping her eyes on Bishop and his men until she reached the boardwalk outside. Only then did she holster her weapon and turn away, walking with measured steps into the gathering twilight. Inside the Golden Horseshoe, Everett Bishop watched her go, his expression unreadable. "What now, Everett?" Hollis asked, breaking the silence that had fallen over the gang. Bishop's lips curled into a smile that contained no humor whatsoever. "Now," he said softly, "we find out everything there is to know about the widow Thorne." He turned to his men, his decision already made. "And then we take what's ours." As night fell over Salvation's End, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Madeline Thorne mounted her silver-grey mare and rode toward the station that bore her name, unaware that the warning shot she had fired with such precision had only delayed a storm that was gathering strength on the horizon. Thorne's station materialized out of the darkness like a fortress against the night, its substantial, log and stone structures silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The main house, built from timber, harvested from the distant mountains and river stone, gathered over years, stood as a testament to Marcus Thorne's belief in permanence. Unlike many territorial homesteads constructed with haste and impermanence, Marcus had built for generations, a legacy more tangible than his name. Madeline dismounted with a fluid grace that belied her exhaustion, leading her mare toward the barn. The property lay unnaturally silent, missing the usual evening sounds of ranch hands returning from distant pastures, horses being settled for the night, the distant lowing of cattle. The absence of life weighed on her as heavily as the confrontation. At the saloon, she'd sent most of the hands to the North Range when she'd left for town that morning, a calculated decision to keep them away from the ranch house until she dealt with matters in Salvation's End. Now, in the empty yard, with only the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant cry of a hunting owl for company, she felt the vulnerability of her position with acute clarity. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the barn, moving toward her with the unhurried gait of someone with no reason to fear the night. Madeline's hand dropped instinctively to her holster, then relaxed as recognition dawned. "Mr. Calloway," she acknowledged, continuing to unsaddle her mare. "You're still up." Vernon Calloway, Thorne Station's foreman for nearly 15 years, stepped into a shaft of moonlight. A man in his early 60s with shoulders still broad despite his advancing years, he moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to conserving energy. His weathered face, lined with the history of drought, blizzard, and cattle drives, bore the resigned expression of a man who had seen the worst the territory had to offer and expected no better in the future. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, taking the saddle from her despite her unspoken protest. "Not with you riding into town alone to face Bishop." He studied her face, reading what had happened with the perception born of long acquaintance. "Didn't go well, I take it?" Madeline led her mare into the barn, reaching for a brush to groom the trail dust from the animal's silver coat. The familiar, repetitive motion provided a comfort that words couldn't match. "Depends on your definition," she replied, working methodically down the mare's flank. "I'm back in one piece. Bishop knows where I stand." Vernon leaned against a stall partition, watching her work. "And where exactly is that?" "The same place." "Marcus would stand," Madeline answered, her movements never faltering. "This land isn't for sale. Not to Bishop, not to anyone." The foreman's sigh carried the weight of impending conflict. "Bishop isn't like other men who've tried to pressure Marcus over the years. He doesn't take no for an answer, and he doesn't play by any rules you'd recognize." "He plays by his own," Madeline corrected, finally looking up from her task. "And so do I." Vernon studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward the house. "You should come inside. There's something you need to see." The main house felt cavernous in its emptiness. Since sending the household staff to stay with relatives in Prosperity Junction 3 days earlier, Madeline had avoided most rooms, sleeping instead on a small cot in Marcus's study rather than face the expanse of their bedroom alone. Now, as she followed Vernon through the central hallway, each room they passed seemed filled with accusing silence. "A rider brought this while you were gone," Vernon explained, leading her into the study. "Said a man in Prosperity paid him to deliver it directly to you." On Marcus's oak desk, the massive piece of furniture he'd commissioned from a master craftsman in St. Louis as a wedding gift for Madeline 7 years earlier, lay a slim envelope sealed with red wax. Madeline approached it with measured caution, noting the fine quality of the paper and the absence of any identifying marks on its surface. "Did this rider have a name?" she asked, picking up the envelope without breaking the seal. "Called himself Smith," Vernon replied with the skepticism such a common alias deserved. "Didn't recognize him. Young fellow, well-spoken, seemed nervous. Kept looking over his shoulder like he expected company. Madeline broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was refined, each letter formed with meticulous precision. Mrs. Thorne, what happened to your husband was regrettable, but necessary. The same fate need not befall you. Bishop is merely the visible hand of more powerful interests. Sell Thorne's station immediately and leave the territory with your life and enough money to start fresh elsewhere. This is the only warning you will receive. A concerned friend, she handed the letter to Vernon without comment, watching his expression darken as he read. So it's confirmed, the foreman said quietly, setting the paper down with the care one might show a venomous snake. Marcus's death was no accident. I never believed it was, Madeline replied, her voice steady despite the cold certainty settling in her chest. A man doesn't get thrown by a horse he's ridden for 5 years without reason, especially not a horseman like Marcus. Vernon's weathered face tightened with suppressed rage. We need to take this to Sheriff Mills in Prosperity. And he would do what exactly? Madeline asked, with no particular rancor. The letter isn't signed. There's no proof connecting it to Bishop or anyone else. It would be dismissed as a cruel prank or an opportunistic attempt to frighten a widow into selling cheap. She moved to the window, gazing out at the darkness that concealed the immense property Marcus had built from wilderness. Thorne Station encompassed over 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, including critical water access points that had become increasingly valuable as the drought stretched into its 3rd year. But its true value lay beneath the surface, a fact Marcus had shared with her only in the final months of his life. Vernon, she said, turning from the window, I need you to gather the men from the North Range. Bring them back, but quietly, no more than 2 or 3 at a time over the next few days. I want it to appear we're still understaffed. The foreman nodded, understanding her strategy. Setting a trap? Creating an opportunity? She corrected. Bishop believes I'm alone and vulnerable. Let's not disabuse him of that notion just yet. Vernon studied her with narrowed eyes. There's something else, isn't there? Something Marcus told you before he died. Madeline hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Marcus had insisted on secrecy, even from Vernon, but circumstances had changed dramatically. Help me with this, she said, moving to a section of paneling behind the desk. She pressed against a decorative molding, revealing a hidden catch. The panel swung silently inward, exposing a small compartment containing a metal lockbox. Marcus installed this the first year we were married, she explained, retrieving the box. Said a man in our position needed to keep certain things secure. She placed the box on the desk and removed a small key from a chain around her neck. The lock opened with a solid click, revealing a collection of documents, a small leather-bound journal, and a folded survey map. 3 months ago, Marcus contracted a geologist from Denver, Madeline explained, unfolding the map. He'd noticed unusual formations on the western section while digging a new well. Vernon leaned forward, examining the map with its detailed annotations and markings. His eyes widened as understanding dawned. Coal, he breathed, running a calloused finger over the meticulously drawn outcroppings. And not just surface deposits. According to these readings, there's an entire seam running through the Western Range, the largest unclaimed deposit in the territory, according to the geologist, Madeline confirmed. With the railroad expansion planned for next spring, whoever controls this land controls the future of power for the entire region. And Bishop knows this? Vernon asked, the pieces falling into place. Not Bishop, Madeline corrected. Whoever Bishop works for. This letter confirms what Marcus suspected. Bishop is just the visible tool. The real threat comes from elsewhere. She handed Vernon a document bearing the territorial governor's seal. Marcus secured mineral rights to the entire property 2 weeks before he died, registered them under my name, not his, and filed duplicate copies with his attorney in Denver. Vernon let out a low whistle as he examined the document. So that's why he insisted you learn to handle business matters and firearms with equal proficiency. He was preparing you." Madeline nodded, the weight of her husband's foresight settling like a physical burden. "He knew they might come for him. He wanted to ensure I could protect what we built." A distant sound caught their attention, hoofbeats approaching at speed. Vernon moved to the window, peering into the darkness. "Riders," he reported, his voice tightening. "At least 5 coming fast from the south road." Madeline closed the lockbox, with swift efficiency, returning it to its hiding place. "Get to the bunkhouse through the back. Wake Eli and Thomas if they're there. Arm yourselves, but stay out of sight unless I signal." "Mrs. Thorne," Vernon began, clearly reluctant to leave her alone. "Vernon," she cut him off, her voice gentle but brooking no argument. "We've prepared for this. Trust that I know what I'm doing." The foreman hesitated only briefly before nodding and slipping through the study's rear door. Madeline moved through the house with purposeful calm, checking that each window was secured before positioning herself on the front porch. She left only a single lamp burning in the front room, enough to signal occupancy without revealing her precise location. The riders thundered into the yard in a cloud of dust and nervous horseflesh, their animals lathered despite the cool night air. Madeline recognized Hollis immediately, his scarred face visible even in the uncertain moonlight. With him rode 4 others from Bishop's gang, each man armed with rifle and sidearm. Madeline stepped forward into a shaft of light from the window, making her presence known while keeping one hand near her holster. "You're trespassing on private property, gentlemen," she called, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising authority. "State your business or be on your way." Hollis dismounted with a theatrical flourish, handing his reins to one of his companions. "Mrs. Thorne," he greeted her, his raspy voice carrying a false note of courtesy. "Apologies for the late call. We bear a message from Mr. Bishop." "He could have delivered it himself," Madeline observed, remaining at the top of the porch steps. Maintaining the higher ground, Hollis smiled, the expression twisting his scar into a grotesque ripple across his features. "Mr. Bishop thought it best to give you time to reconsider your position after your display in town." He spread his hands in a gesture of mock reasonableness. "He's a patient man, but even patience has its limits." "My position remains unchanged," Madeline replied evenly. "Thorne Station is not for sale, not to Bishop or anyone else." Hollis's pretense of civility evaporated. "That's unfortunate, ma'am, truly it is. You see, we weren't just bringing a message." He nodded to his men, who began to spread out around the yard. "We came to offer a demonstration of what happens to those who refuse Mr. Bishop's generous offers." From behind one of the riders, a small object arced through the air, landing with a dull thud on the porch near Madeline's feet. A bundle of oil-soaked rags bound around a stick of dynamite, its fuse hissing as it burned down toward detonation. Without hesitation, Madeline drew and fired in one fluid motion. Her bullet struck the fuse mere inches from the explosive, severing it with surgical precision. The disabled bundle lay harmless on the porch, its threat neutralized. Silence fell over the yard, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses. Hollis stared at the diffused dynamite, then at Madeline, his expression transforming from arrogant certainty to wary reassessment. "That was unwise," Madeline stated, her revolver now trained steadily on Hollis. "As was coming here uninvited." Hollis recovered quickly, his hand drifting toward his own weapon. "Impressive trick, Mrs. Thorne, but there are 5 of us and only 1 of you." "Those aren't favorable odds," Madeline agreed, her aim never wavering. "For you." Before Hollis could respond, a rifle shot cracked from the darkness near the barn. One of Bishop's men cried out as his hat went flying from his head, a neat hole punched through its crown. A second shot followed almost immediately, kicking up dirt between another rider's horse's hooves, causing the animal to rear in panic. "That's 2 warnings," Madeline called out as the men scrambled to control their frightened mounts. "The next ones won't be aimed at hats or dirt. Now get off my land." Hollis's face contorted with rage, but his survival instinct overrode his pride. "This isn't over, Mrs. Thorne," he snarled, swinging back onto his horse. "Not by a long measure." "No." Madeline agreed, her revolver still trained on him as the men retreated. "It's just beginning." She remained on the porch until the last hoofbeat faded into the distance. Only then did Vernon emerge from the shadows by the barn, a rifle resting comfortably against his shoulder. "Thought you said trust you to handle it," he remarked dryly, joining her on the porch. Madeline holstered her weapon with the ghost of a smile. "I never said I'd handle it alone." She bent to retrieve the diffused dynamite, examining it with clinical detachment. "They'll be back, and not just with intimidation tactics. This was a test. They wanted to see how I'd respond, whether I'd break under pressure." "And what did they learn?" Vernon asked, watching her carefully. Madeline's amber eyes reflected the moonlight with unsettling clarity as she looked toward the road Bishop's men had taken. "They learned that Marcus Thorne's widow doesn't frighten easily," she replied, "and that her aim is considerably better than they anticipated." As she turned to go inside, Vernon's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Thorne, Madeline, there's something you should know about Marcus." He hesitated, choosing his words with unusual care. "The night before he died, he asked me to give you something if anything happened to him. Said to wait until you truly needed it." From his vest pocket, Vernon withdrew a tarnished silver key. "It opens a cabinet in the old line shack on the western ridge. Whatever he left there, he thought it might save your life someday." Madeline accepted the key, its weight seeming far greater than its size warranted. "Thank you, Vernon." As she closed the door behind her, Madeline Thorne knew with absolute certainty that the confrontation at the Golden Horseshoe and tonight's failed intimidation were merely opening moves in a game with rules written in blood and property deeds. Bishop and his unseen employers would return with greater force and more deadly purpose. Her hand closed around the key Vernon had given her. Whatever secret Marcus had left in that distant line shack, the time to retrieve it had come. Dawn would bring new challenges, and Madeline Thorne intended to face them with every advantage her husband's foresight had provided. Dawn broke over Thorne Station in a spectacle of crimson and gold, bathing the weathered buildings in light that belied the tension that had settled over the property. Madeline stood at the edge of the western pasture, Marcus's brass spyglass extended as she surveyed the distant line shack that had become her immediate objective. The humble structure, barely visible against the backdrop of scrub and rock, sat, perched on a ridge that marked the western boundary of Thorne land. The property's geography presented both opportunity and challenge. The line shack could only be approached by 3 routes: the main trail that wound through exposed terrain, offering no cover for nearly a mile, a steep ravine to the north that required navigating treacherous switchbacks, or the southern creek bed that provided concealment but would be watched by anyone monitoring the property. Each approach presented its own dangers, especially if Bishop had men surveilling the area. "Thinking of riding out there today?" Vernon's voice came from behind her, the foreman approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Madeline accepted one, with a grateful nod, collapsing the spyglass with her free hand. "Not just thinking." Vernon sipped his coffee, his expression contemplative as he studied the distant ridge. "Bishop's men will be watching the main trails by now." "I'm counting on it," Madeline replied, her gaze still fixed on the distant structure. "How many men do we have back at the station?" 7 returned before dawn, Vernon answered. "Good men, loyal to the Thorne name. I've stationed them around the property, keeping out of sight but ready if trouble returns." Madeline nodded, satisfaction, momentarily easing the tension that had settled permanently between her shoulders. "And Thatcher? Did he make it to town?" Left before first light with your letter for Judge Clayton in Prosperity Junction, Vernon confirmed. Should reach him by midday if he pushes hard. The letter contained documentation of the mineral rights Marcus had secured, along with a formal request for territorial protection given the implied threats against the property. It was a necessary precaution. Though Madeline harbored few illusions about its efficacy, the territorial justice system moved with glacial slowness, particularly when powerful interests might prefer delays. It won't bring help immediately, she acknowledged, but it establishes our legal position if matters escalate further. Vernon's weathered face creased with concern. If, Mrs. Thorne, we both know there's no if about it. Bishop's just the first wave. When he reports back to whoever's pulling his strings that intimidation failed, they'll send something worse. All the more reason to discover what Marcus left in that line shack, Madeline replied, her decision crystallizing. I need you to organize a diversion, something visible enough to draw attention, but not so provocative that it triggers immediate retaliation. The foreman considered this, absently running a thumb along the rim of his cup. We could move part of the herd to the south pasture. Takes at least 4 men, lots of dust, impossible to miss from the ridge where Bishop's lookouts are likely. Positioned. Perfect, Madeline agreed. Begin in 2 hours. I'll take the north ravine while their attention is focused south. Vernon's expression darkened. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Thorne, but that ravine's treacherous even for an experienced rider. One misstep and— I grew up in these mountains before I ever met Marcus, Madeline interrupted gently. My father was a survey scout for the army. I've navigated worse terrain than that ravine since I was 12 years old. Something in her tone brooked no argument. Vernon nodded, resigned to her decision, if not entirely comfortable with it. At least take Eli with you. The boy's part Apache, moves like a ghost when he needs to. Madeline considered the suggestion. Eli Whitecloud had been one of Marcus's most trusted hands, a quiet young man of mixed heritage whose tracking skills were unmatched on Thorne's station. His presence would provide security without compromising speed or stealth. Tell him to prepare 2 horses and meet me behind the north stable in an hour, she decided. No rifles, they'll catch the sun, just sidearms and knives. As Vernon departed to make arrangements, Madeline returned her attention to the distant ridge. Whatever Marcus had hidden in that line shack, he had considered it important enough to create elaborate precautions for its eventual discovery. Important enough, perhaps, to have cost him his life when others learned of its existence. An hour later, Madeline emerged from the main house, transformed for the journey ahead. Gone was the riding dress and formal attire of the previous day. Instead, she wore practical canvas trousers, tucked into well-worn boots, a man's cotton shirt beneath a close-fitting leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to shadow her face. Her copper-streaked hair was braided tightly against her head, reducing any risk of it catching on brush during the precarious descent through the ravine. Eli Whitecloud waited with 2 horses at the arranged meeting point, his own attire similar to Madeline's, though adorned with subtle beadwork at the collar that spoke to his heritage. At 25, Eli moved with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in wild country. His dark eyes missed nothing, constantly, scanning the surrounding terrain with the instinctive vigilance of a born tracker. Mrs. Thorne, he greeted her with a respectful nod. Vernon explained our destination. The north approach is challenging but manageable if we leave the horses at the upper ridge and proceed on foot for the final descent. Madeline checked the cinch on her saddle, then verified that both revolvers were secured in their holsters, one at her hip, the other in a shoulder rig concealed by her vest. A hunting knife hung at her belt, and in an inner pocket, the key Vernon had given her rested securely against a small packet of ammunition. "Any sign of watchers on the western boundary?" she asked, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. Eli, mounted his own horse, a dun gelding chosen for sure-footedness rather than speed. 2 men on the south ridge as of dawn, he reported. Another near the creek crossing, all Bishop's men, based on their gear and manner. None near our intended route, but that doesn't mean they won't spot movement if we're careless. The diversion Vernon had arranged would begin soon, a noisy cattle drive to the southern pasture that would draw the attention of any observers. Their window would be brief, but sufficient if they moved with purpose. "Then we won't be careless," Madeline replied simply, urging her mount forward. They rode in silence for the first hour, keeping to sheltered draws and wooded sections that provided cover from distant observation. As they approached the more exposed terrain near the ravine, the distant sounds of the cattle drive reached them, the lowing of reluctant herds, shouts of cowboys, the orchestrated commotion designed to draw attention southward. Eli raised a hand in silent signal as they reached the upper edge of the ravine. They dismounted, securing their horses in a thicket where the animals would remain hidden, yet could be quickly retrieved if necessary. From this point, the descent would be on foot, a treacherous half-mile of loose shale and narrow switchbacks that eventually opened into the small plateau where the line shack stood. "I'll lead," Eli stated, rather than offered, already moving. "To the edge to scout the best route down. Step exactly where I step and test each foothold before committing your weight." Madeline nodded, appreciating his expertise without feeling diminished by it. Together, they began the careful descent, navigating between jutting rocks and treacherous slides of loose stone. The ravine walls provided cover from distant observation, but the price was steep. One misstep could result in a fall that would render their mission moot and Thorn Station vulnerable. Halfway down, Eli froze, raising a closed fist in the universal signal for immediate halt. Madeline stopped instantly, her hand drifting toward her revolver as she followed his gaze. 20 yards below, partially concealed behind an outcropping of granite, a man crouched with a rifle braced against his shoulder, scanning the southern pastures where the cattle drive was underway, one of Bishop's watchers, positioned to monitor the very diversion they had created. Eli and Madeline exchanged a silent glance, weighing options without words. The watcher's position blocked their intended path. Attempting to circumvent him would require exposed movement along the ravine wall that would almost certainly draw his attention. Backtracking would cost precious hours they couldn't afford to lose. With deliberate slowness, Eli removed his knife from its sheath, the blade catching no reflection in the shadowed ravine. Madeline shook her head once, decisively, then pointed to herself and made a circling motion with her finger. Eli's expression registered momentary surprise, then understanding, followed by reluctant agreement. Madeline began a careful descent, moving not toward the watcher, but along a parallel route that would bring her to a position above and behind him. Each movement was considered, tested, executed with the patience of someone who understood that speed invited disaster in such terrain. 10 minutes of careful navigation brought her to a narrow ledge directly above the oblivious lookout. From her new vantage point, she could see the man more clearly. Young, perhaps no more than 20, with the rough attire and calloused hands of someone who'd worked cattle before turning to less reputable employment. His attention remained fixed on the distant cattle drive, his back vulnerably exposed to the ravine wall he'd assumed provided security. Madeline drew her revolver, reversed her grip to hold it by the barrel, and with swift decisiveness brought the heavy wooden grip down on the back of the watcher's head. He crumpled without a sound, the rifle clattering softly against the stone as he fell forward. Eli appeared beside her within moments, checking the unconscious man with clinical efficiency. "Clean hit," he murmured approvingly. "He'll wake with a mighty headache, but no permanent damage." Together, they secured the watcher with strips of leather cut from his own belt and saddle tack, gagging him with his bandana and concealing him behind the granite outcropping where he'd established his post. His rifle they disassembled, scattering critical components among the rocks where they would be difficult to locate, even if he managed to free himself. "How much time?" Madeline asked as they resumed their descent, now moving with greater urgency. "The cattle drive will maintain distraction for another hour at most," Eli calculated. "This one was supposed to report back to someone. When he doesn't, they'll come looking." They reached the bottom of the ravine without further incident, emerging onto the small plateau where the line shack stood in solitary testament to the boundaries of Thorn property. The structure was simple, a single room built of hand-hewn logs chinked with clay, its roof of split shingles weathered to silver-grey by seasons of sun and storm. A narrow porch fronted the building, its boards worn smooth by years of boots seeking shelter from territorial weather. The apparent abandonment of the shack raised Madeline's suspicions immediately. If this building contained something valuable, enough for Marcus to secure with special precautions, it should have warranted a guard from Bishop's men. "Something's wrong," she murmured, scanning the surrounding terrain with renewed vigilance. "This is too easy." Eli nodded in agreement, moving silently around the perimeter of the small clearing, examining the ground with the focused attention of a practiced tracker. He returned moments later, his expression grave. "3 men were here yesterday," he reported, crouching to indicate barely visible tracks in the hard-packed earth. "They spent time searching the shack, but departed toward the south before nightfall. They didn't find what they sought." The information provided both relief and heightened urgency. Bishop's men had already discovered the line shack's existence, searched it, and departed empty-handed, which meant whatever Marcus had hidden remained secure. But their awareness of the building also meant they might return with more thorough methods or additional manpower. "Keep watch," Madeline instructed, approaching the weathered door with the key Vernon had provided. The lock was concealed beneath a seemingly decorative metal plate beside the door, the kind of security feature Marcus had favored, hiding complexity behind apparent simplicity. The key turned with minor resistance, the mechanism inside protesting years of disuse before yielding with a decisive click. Inside, the line shack presented an appearance of utilitarian neglect. A narrow cot against one wall, a rough-hewn table and single chair, a small iron stove for heat and cooking during boundary patrols. A quick glance confirmed Eli's assessment. The interior showed signs of recent, hasty searching. Floorboards had been pried up and replaced without care, the thin mattress sliced open and its stuffing partially removed, the stovepipe disassembled and discarded. Madeline stood in the center of the disruption, turning slowly as she considered the space through Marcus's eyes. Her husband had been methodical to the point of predictability in some ways. Their private joke had been his adherence to patterns that mystified others, but made perfect sense to him. If he had hidden something here intended specifically for her to find, he would have placed it according to a logic only she might recognize. Her gaze settled on the single window, its glass cloudy with dust and age. The orientation struck her with sudden clarity. The window faced east toward the main House of Thorn station, visible as a distant smudge on clear days. More specifically, it aligned precisely with their bedroom window, where they had spent every night of their marriage until Marcus's death. Moving to the window, Madeline examined the framing with careful fingers. The right side of the frame appeared solid, but the left yielded slightly to pressure, a barely perceptible give that would be indistinguishable from the natural settling of an aging structure to anyone not specifically testing for it. With careful pressure applied in opposing directions, a section of the frame pivoted on a concealed pin, revealing a narrow compartment within the wall itself. From this space, Madeline withdrew a leather pouch wrapped around an object of substantial weight. "Mrs. Thorn," Eli called softly from the doorway, "we should move. Dust on the south trail, riders approaching." Madeline secured her discovery inside her vest without examining it further. Time for inspection would come later if they successfully escaped the approaching threat. How many and how far? 3 men, moving fast, Eli reported, already retreating from the door. 10 minutes, perhaps less. They exited the shack, Madeline pausing only long enough to relock the hidden mechanism that had protected Marcus's secret. Their planned retreat up the ravine was now compromised. Climbing would make them vulnerable targets for anyone with a rifle and reasonable aim. The southern approach was blocked by the incoming riders. That left only the western descent, a route so steep and hazardous that even experienced riders typically avoided it. "The western drop?" Eli asked, reading her thoughts with uncanny accuracy. Madeline nodded grimly. "Single file, you first. Your tracking skills will find the best route down." They moved with urgent purpose toward the western edge of the plateau, where the land fell away in a near vertical drop for 50 feet before gradually leveling into a series of natural terraces formed by centuries of erosion. Navigating this descent on foot would be perilous even under ideal circumstances. Doing so with hostile pursuers potentially minutes behind transformed it into a desperate gamble. Yet as they began picking their way down the treacherous slope, using exposed tree roots and rocky outcroppings as natural handholds, Madeline felt a strange clarity descend. Each decision became immediate and essential. Where to place a foot, how to distribute weight, which handhold would support rather than crumble. The broader concerns of Thorn Station, Bishop's threats, and even Marcus's hidden legacy receded, temporarily behind the fundamental imperative to survive the next step and the next. Halfway down the precipitous slope, the distant crack of a rifle shattered their concentration. A bullet splintered bark from a tree trunk inches from Eli's head, sending fragments of wood cascading into the void below. They had been spotted by the arriving riders, who had evidently found their unconscious lookout and now positioned themselves at the edge of the plateau above. "Keep moving," Madeline urged as Eli hesitated, searching for cover that didn't exist on the exposed face. Another shot rang out, this one striking rock near Madeline's position, ricocheting with a malevolent whine. Into the distance, the shooters were adjusting their aim, finding the range. The next shots would likely find their marks unless something changed their calculations. Drawing one of her revolvers while maintaining a precarious one-handed grip on a jutting stone, Madeline twisted toward their pursuers. The position was impossible for accurate shooting. Her body balanced awkwardly against the cliff face, her firing hand unsupported, the target's small figures at the top of a sheer rise. Conventional wisdom would declare hitting anything under such conditions a matter of pure luck rather than skill. But Madeline Thorne had not spent countless hours at Marcus's side perfecting conventional marksmanship. She fired 3 times in rapid succession, each shot echoing across the ravine like thunder. Above them, one of the rifles splintered in its owner's hands, the barrel damaged beyond use. Another shot struck a canteen at a second shooter's hip, the sudden spray of water, startling him into momentary retreat. The third bullet kicked up stone, precisely between the feet of the third man, causing him to stumble backward with a shouted curse. Warning shots, all 3, delivered with impossible precision from an untenable position. The display had its intended effect. The shooters withdrew from the exposed edge, providing the precious minutes needed for Madeline and Eli to complete their descent to the relative safety of the lower terraces. From there, natural overhangs and denser vegetation provided cover for their continued retreat toward the creek that would eventually lead them to a position where they could circle back to their waiting horses. When they finally paused to catch their breath in the shelter of a cottonwood grove, Eli regarded Madeline with undisguised amazement. "I've seen men train their entire lives who couldn't make those shots from solid ground with a braced rifle," he said quietly. "You did it one-handed while hanging off a cliff face." Madeline checked her remaining ammunition, reloading the spent. chambers with the methodical precision that characterized all her movements. "Marcus was an excellent teacher," she replied simply. "That wasn't just teaching," Eli countered, his voice carrying something between respect and awe. "That was—" He seemed to struggle for the appropriate word. "Necessary," Madeline supplied, securing her revolver back in its holster. Only then did she withdraw the leather pouch she'd retrieved from the line shack, unwrapping it carefully, to reveal its contents. Inside lay a Colt Peacemaker unlike any standard model. The revolver featured custom modifications immediately apparent to anyone familiar with firearms: an extended barrel with precision rifling, specialized grips contoured for smaller hands than the typical male shooter, and most distinctively, elaborate silver inlay work along the cylinder depicting an intricate pattern of thorny roses. "The thorn rose," Eli breathed, recognition dawning. "I thought it was just a story." Madeline examined the weapon with reverent care, checking its action and balance with practiced hands. "Most stories contain seeds of truth," she replied softly. The legend of the thorn rose had circulated in whispers throughout the territory for years. A custom weapon crafted by the legendary gunsmith Isaac Bell for a mysterious client, allegedly capable of accuracy that bordered on the supernatural in the right hands. Some claimed it had belonged to a female sharpshooter who had performed with distinction in traveling shows before disappearing into obscurity. Others insisted it had been commissioned by a wealthy cattle baron as a gift for a favored protégé, who had met an untimely end. No version of the legend had ever connected the weapon to Marcus Thorne or his wife. Beneath the revolver in the pouch lay a folded sheet of paper in Marcus's distinctive handwriting. Madeline opened it with careful fingers, reading the brief message inscribed there. "My dearest Madeline, if you're reading this, then what I feared has come to pass. The thorn rose returns to its rightful owner. Remember what your father taught you, what I helped you perfect. When the moment comes, trust your instincts and your aim. Both are truer than you know. They will come for the land, for what lies beneath it. The proof you need is secured with Clayton. Show no mercy to those who showed none to me. Forever yours." Marcus Ely respectfully averted his eyes as Madeline folded the letter and tucked it securely inside her vest. When she looked up again, her expression had transformed, grief momentarily visible before being subsumed by a calm determination that seemed to radiate from her very core. "We need to return to the station," she said, securing the thorn rose in her shoulder holster where it nested as if crafted specifically for her frame, which, she now realized, it had been. "Bishop's men will report what happened here. Their next move will come swiftly and with greater force." As they began the long circuit that would return them to their horses and eventually to Thorn Station, Madeline felt the weight of Marcus's final gift against her side. Not just a weapon of exceptional quality, but a confirmation of what she had begun to suspect since his death. Marcus Thorne's fatal accident had been nothing of the sort, and the men responsible were now moving against her with the same ruthless determination. What they couldn't know, what Bishop and his hidden employers couldn't possibly understand, was that in targeting Marcus Thorne's widow, they had made a crucial miscalculation. The warning shots she had fired thus far, both at the Golden Horseshoe and on the cliff face today, had demonstrated only a fraction of her true capability. The thorn rose had returned to the hand it was crafted for, and when next Madeline Thorne pulled its trigger, she would no longer be firing warnings. Thorn Station appeared tranquil in the late afternoon light as Madeline and Eli approached from the north, having circled wide to avoid any watchers Bishop might have posted along more direct routes. The journey back had taken nearly 3 hours longer than their outbound trip, a necessary precaution after the confrontation at the line shack. Exhaustion pulled at Madeline's muscles, but the weight of the thorn rose against her ribs provided a curious counterbalance, a tangible connection to Marcus, and a reminder of all that remained at stake. As they crested the final rise overlooking the ranch, Eli raised a closed fist in the silent signal to halt. His keen eyes narrowed as he studied the scene below. "Something's wrong," he murmured, sliding from his saddle to reduce his silhouette against the sky. Madeline followed suit, crouching beside him as he pointed toward the main house. The yards, too empty. No movement at the bunkhouse, no smoke from the kitchen chimney. Madeline withdrew Marcus's brass spyglass from her saddlebag, extending it to study the property in detail. The foreman's quarters showed no signs of life, nor did the barn, where at least 2 hands should have been tending evening chores. The corral gate hung slightly ajar, a condition Vernon would never have permitted under normal circumstances. "Ambush?" she asked quietly, collapsing the spyglass with a decisive click. Eli shook his head slowly, uncertainty evident in his usually confident assessment. No horses hidden in the usual places, no reflection off rifle barrels from the roof positions. He gestured toward the periphery of the property. But the cattle in the north pasture have been gathered tight near the fence line. Someone's been moving them recently. Madeline considered their options, weighing the risk of riding openly into what might be a trap against the urgent need to determine what had transpired during their absence. Her decision crystallized as she noted a curl of smoke rising from an unexpected source, not the main house or bunkhouse, but the small caretaker's cabin that sat apart from the other buildings, rarely used except during roundup season when extra hands temporarily swelled the ranch's population. "We approach separately," she decided. "I'll circle east and come in behind the main house. You approach the caretaker's cabin from the creek bed. That smoke might be Vernon's signal." Eli nodded, understanding her reasoning without requiring elaboration. "If it's a trap..." Madeline's hand moved briefly to the thorn rose, confirming its placement. "Then we ensure the cost of springing it exceeds its value." They separated at the base of the ridge, Eli disappearing into the dense undergrowth that lined the creek, while Madeline guided her mare toward a stand of cottonwoods that would provide cover for her approach to the rear of the main house. The familiar surroundings of Thorn Station had acquired an alien quality in the growing twilight. The buildings she had called home for 7 years now transformed into potential sources of threat. The open spaces that had once represented freedom now exposed killing grounds to be navigated with extreme caution. She secured her horse in a sheltered gully behind the house, removing her boots to ensure silent movement across the packed earth of the yard. With the thorn rose drawn and ready, she ghosted from shadow to shadow, approaching the main house from its blind side, where the kitchen entrance provided the most concealed access. The door yielded to her touch without resistance, confirming her worst suspicions. No one inside would have left it unlatched as darkness approached. The kitchen beyond lay in disarray, signs of a hasty meal, abandoned mid-preparation, evident in the half-chopped vegetables on the cutting board and coffee boiling down to tar in a pot at the edge of the stove. Madeline moved through the house, with practiced silence, checking each room with methodical thoroughness. The study showed signs of thorough searching. Marcus's desk drawers pulled out and emptied onto the floor. Books swept from shelves, the panel concealing the hidden compartment, splintered open and the lockbox absent. The parlor and dining room had been similarly ransacked, furniture overturned and cushions sliced open in a search for hidden valuables or documents. When she reached the main bedroom, Madeline paused at the threshold, momentarily disoriented by the scale of destruction within. The mattress had been gutted, its stuffing strewn across the floor like drifted snow. Every drawer had been emptied, every personal item examined and discarded. Most disturbingly, each of Marcus's suits had been removed from the wardrobe and systematically shredded, as if the searchers believed documents might have been sewn into the linings. The devastation spoke not just of thoroughness, but of rage. A Personal animus that transcended mere robbery or intimidation. This wasn't just a search, it was desecration, an attempt to eradicate the very memory of Marcus Thorne from his own home. A floorboard creaked in the hallway behind her. Madeline pivoted smoothly, the thorn rose rising to target level in one fluid. Motion. Vernon Calloway stood framed in the doorway, his weathered face bearing fresh bruising around his left eye and a split lip that had crusted with dried blood. His hands were raised slightly, palms forward in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. "Thank God," he breathed, lowering his hands as Madeline withdrew her aim. "When we couldn't find you after they rode out, I feared the worst." "What happened?" Madeline asked, holstering the revolver and crossing to examine the foreman's injuries with clinical detachment. Vernon winced as her fingers probed a particularly tender spot along his jawline. Bishop's men, at least 15 of them, led by Hollis. They came just after midday, caught us separated across the property. His expression darkened with self-recrimination. "Should have anticipated they might move, while our attention was divided between your expedition and the cattle diversion." The other hands. "Locked in the root cellar behind the smokehouse. Roughed up some, but no serious injuries." Vernon gestured toward his own face with grim humor. "I received special attention as befitting my position." Madeline moved to the window, peering out at the yard where twilight had now settled completely. "How long have they been gone?" "About 2 hours," Vernon replied. "Left a clear message before riding out. Bishop expects you at the Golden Horseshoe by noon tomorrow to sign over Thorne Station. Said to tell you that refusing wasn't an option you'd want to explore." A soft whistle from the yard below. 3. Notes in a pattern that matched the meadowlark's evening call, but carried just enough artifice to identify its human origin. Eli's signal that he had secured the perimeter and found no immediate threats. "Help me gather the men," Madeline said, already moving toward the door. "I need to understand exactly what Bishop's men took and what they left behind." As Vernon led her toward the root cellar to free the imprisoned ranch hands, Madeline noted details her initial survey had missed. Hoofprints from at least a dozen horses churning the usually immaculate yard to mud, a window in the foreman's. Quarters shattered by gunfire, the water trough riddled with bullet holes in what appeared to be purely malicious destruction. The ranch hands emerged from the root cellar with expressions that mingled relief, embarrassment, and simmering rage. Most bore evidence of rough handling, split lips, darkening bruises, torn clothing, but as Vernon had reported, none appeared seriously injured. Their collective mood shifted from defeat to renewed determination as Madeline outlined what she had discovered at the line shack and the revelation of Marcus's final gift. "Bishop's invited me to surrender at noon tomorrow," she concluded, addressing the assembled men who had gathered in the bunkhouse, the one building that had largely escaped the raiders' destructive attention. "I intend to accept that invitation, but not for the purpose he anticipates." A murmur of concern rippled through the group. One of the older hands, a weathered Texan called McKendrick, who had worked Thorne land since before Madeline's arrival, voiced what many clearly thought. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Thorne, but that's suicide, plain and simple. Bishop's gathered near 20 men in town. Walking in there alone would be handing them exactly what they want." "Who said anything about alone?" Madeline countered, her gaze sweeping the assembled faces. "Or walking in unprepared?" She turned to Vernon. "The hidden cache in the north pasture, was it discovered?" The foreman shook his head. "They searched the obvious places, house, barn, outbuildings, didn't have time to comb every acre of the property. Good. We'll need everything stored there." She addressed the group again. "Bishop believes he's won. That I'll arrive tomorrow desperate, isolated, and prepared to surrender everything Marcus built to save my own life." Her hand moved unconsciously to the thorn rose at her side. "His miscalculation will be our advantage." as the men dispersed. To tend injuries and prepare for what promised to be their most challenging day since coming to work for Thorn Station, Eli approached Madeline with the quiet purposefulness that characterized his movements. "Found something you should see," he said simply, leading her outside and across the yard to the blacksmith's shed. The small building stood slightly apart from the others, its interior normally dominated by the forge and the implements of metalwork necessary for a functioning ranch. Now, however, the central space had been cleared to accommodate something entirely unexpected: a man bound securely to a sturdy chair, a canvas sack covering his head. Despite his restraints, the prisoner sat with a straight-backed rigidity that suggested military training or considerable self-discipline. Eli removed the hood with a single, smooth motion, revealing a face Madeline had never seen before. The man appeared to be in his 40s, his features aristocratic beneath a week's growth of salt and pepper beard. He wore the attire of a typical cattleman, though the quality of the fabric and stitching suggested Eastern manufacture rather than frontier practicality. Despite his compromised position, he regarded Madeline with calm assessment rather than fear or anger. "Found him unconscious behind the caretaker's cabin," Eli explained. "Bishop's men knocked him out, but apparently forgot about him in there. Haste to depart. He was carrying these." From a nearby workbench, Eli retrieved a leather portfolio and an expensive pocket watch. The portfolio contained various documents, including a letter of introduction from the territorial governor, addressed to Marcus Thorn, dated 3 weeks prior, and several survey maps similar to those Marcus had kept in his lockbox. The watch, when opened, revealed an inscription that confirmed the stranger's identity: to Lawrence Preston Sullivan. With gratitude for exemplary service, the United States Geological Survey Madeline studied their unexpected guest with renewed interest. "You're a long way from your usual jurisdiction, Mr. Sullivan." The man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging both the observation and the implied question. "I was supposed to meet with your husband 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Thorn. When word reached Denver about his unfortunate accident, my superiors suggested I might benefit from making your acquaintance instead." "Release him," Madeline instructed Eli, who complied with swift efficiency. Sullivan rubbed his wrists where the rope had chafed, but made no complaint about his treatment. "I must say, this isn't quite the reception I anticipated." "These are unusual circumstances," Madeline replied, offering no apology. "Why would the U.S. Geological Survey have interest in Thorn Station?" Sullivan glanced at the documents Eli had spread across the workbench. "The same reason Everett Bishop and his employers do, though with considerably different intentions. Your husband contacted our Denver office approximately 3 months ago regarding certain mineral findings on your property." "The coal seam," Madeline acknowledged, watching for his reaction. A brief smile crossed Sullivan's features. "A valuable discovery, certainly, but not the one that prompted my journey here." He selected one of the survey maps, pointing to markings. "In the western section of Thorn property, your husband's initial geological samples suggested something far more significant beneath the coal deposits. Oil, Mrs. Thorn. A potentially massive reserve if the preliminary assessments prove accurate." The revelation landed with physical force. Marcus had shared the coal discovery with her, knowing its significance for the railroad expansion, but had said nothing about oil, a resource whose value was only beginning to be understood in the territories but which Eastern industrialists were already battling to control. "And the federal government's interest in this discovery?" she asked, her mind racing to incorporate this new information into her understanding of the forces aligned against her. "The Department of the Interior is concerned about unregulated exploitation of such resources," Sullivan explained. "Your husband approached us with a proposal: federal protection for Thorn Station in exchange for structured, sustainable development of the resources beneath it." He paused, his expression growing grave. 3 days after our scheduled meeting, Marcus Thorne suffered his fatal riding accident. A remarkable coincidence, wouldn't you say? There are no coincidences where Thorne Station is concerned, Mr. Sullivan, Madeline replied, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. Only calculated actions and their consequences. She turned to Eli. Take Mr. Sullivan to the main house. Ensure he's provided with food and whatever medical attention he requires. To Sullivan, she added, we'll continue this discussion later. There are preparations that require my immediate attention. As Sullivan was escorted from the blacksmith's shed, Vernon entered, his expression suggesting he had overheard at least part of the exchange. Oil, he said quietly. That explains the persistence, the resources they're willing to commit. Bishop isn't just working for wealthy cattle interests. He's the instrument of oil speculators. Men who wouldn't hesitate to arrange a fatal accident for a stubborn landowner, Madeline agreed, or to threaten his widow when she proved equally intractable. She withdrew the thorn rose from its holster, examining the exquisite craftsmanship in the lantern light. The silver inlay work that gave the weapon its name caught the flame, reflecting it in patterns that seemed almost alive. Marcus knew, she said softly, not just about the threats to his life, but about what would follow if he died. That's why he secured the mineral rights in my name, why he prepared this. Her fingers traced the thorny rose pattern along the cylinder. He expected me to finish what he started. Vernon watched her with the careful attention of someone witnessing a transformation. What exactly did he start, Mrs. Thorne? Madeline returned the revolver to its holster with a decisive click. A reckoning, Vernon. One that Bishop and his employers never anticipated. Through the open door of the shed, the main house of Thorne Station was visible, its windows glowing with lamplight against the gathering darkness. Despite the day's violations, the property retained a stubborn permanence, stone and timber rising. From the earth as a declaration of human determination to carve meaning from wilderness. Bishop expects surrender tomorrow, Madeline continued, her voice taking on the quiet authority that had increasingly characterized her since Marcus's death. Instead, he'll receive justice. But first, we have considerable work to do. The hours that followed unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. The cache Vernon had mentioned proved to contain not just additional weapons and ammunition, but communications from Marcus that outlined contingency plans in the event of escalating threats against the property. Acting on these instructions, ranch hands were dispatched on specific missions, some to neighboring properties whose owners had long-standing alliances with the Thorns, others to strategic positions surrounding the town of Salvation's End. Lawrence Sullivan, once his identity and purpose were verified beyond doubt, provided invaluable intelligence regarding the legal mechanisms that could be employed to secure federal protection for the property, protections that would have already been in place had Marcus lived to complete his negotiations with the Geological Survey. As midnight approached, Madeline retreated briefly to Marcus's study, now partially restored to order by Vernon's efficient management. From a secret compartment beneath the floorboards that Bishop's men had overlooked in their search, located not behind the desk where they had concentrated their efforts, but beneath the potted palm in the corner that Marcus had insisted complemented the room's aesthetics, she retrieved a small rosewood box. Inside lay items of sentimental rather than monetary value. The pressed wildflower from their first meeting when Marcus had offered to guide her father's survey expedition. The simple gold band that had belonged to her mother, a daguerreotype of her parents taken shortly before her father's death in a Comanche raid. Beneath these mementos lay a folded document with the territorial seal, their marriage certificate, modified to include an unusual addendum regarding property rights that Marcus had insisted upon, despite the territorial clerk's confusion. In the event of the death or incapacitation of Marcus James Thorne, all rights, titles and interests in Thorne Station and its appurtenances shall transfer without reservation or limitation to Madeline Eleanor Thorne, née Hargrove. At the time, she had viewed it as merely another example of Marcus's meticulous nature and forward thinking. Now, with the revelation of oil beneath their land and the powerful interests willing to kill for it, his insistence on this specific legal language acquired profound significance. A soft knock at the study door interrupted her contemplation. Eli stood in the doorway, his expression suggesting news of importance. "Ryder just returned from town," he reported. "Bishop's gathered his men at the Golden Horseshoe as expected. But there's something else. A private rail car arrived at the Salvation's End depot this afternoon. Curtains drawn, guards posted. No one saw who it contained, but rumor suggests it's someone of considerable importance from back east." Madeline returned the rosewood box to its hiding place, securing the floorboard with practiced precision. Bishop's employer coming to witness his triumph in person. "Or to ensure there are no loose ends," Eli suggested grimly. "Men like that don't leave witnesses to their methods." "No," Madeline agreed, rising to face him. "They don't." She crossed to the gun cabinet that had been repaired after Bishop's men had damaged it during their search. From its depths, she withdrew a specialized leather case that, when opened, revealed custom tools designed for the maintenance of precision firearms. "I need an hour alone," she told Eli. "Then we'll finalize preparations for tomorrow." As the young man departed, Madeline laid the thorn rose on Marcus's desk and began the methodical process of cleaning and checking every component of the weapon. Each action was performed with the focused attention of a ritual: oiling the cylinder, verifying the tension in the spring, testing the trigger pull for consistency. The familiar routine centered her thoughts, allowing her to consider the confrontation to come with clinical detachment rather than emotional reaction. Bishop and his unseen employer believed they had crafted a scenario with only one possible outcome: her surrender and the transfer of Thorne Station to their control. Their certainty arose from a fundamental miscalculation that Marcus had anticipated, and in his final acts had prepared her to exploit. They saw only a widow, vulnerable and isolated. They had never witnessed what had earned her the name Isaiah. Hargrove's daughter had carried before. She became Madeline Thorne. As the thorn rose gleamed with renewed purpose in the lamplight, Madeline loaded each chamber with the special ammunition Marcus had custom-ordered from the same gunsmith who had crafted the revolver itself. Each bullet was precisely weighted and balanced to complement the weapon's unique characteristics, allowing for accuracy that standard rounds could never achieve. Tomorrow at noon, Bishop and his employer would learn the cost of underestimating Madeline Thorne. The warning shots were finished. What remained was a reckoning long overdue, one delivered with the precision that had once made the Thorn Rose a name whispered with awe in territories where marksmanship meant survival. By dawn, Vernon had assembled the ranch hands in the yard, each man armed and positioned according to the strategy Madeline had outlined during the night. Sullivan, now functioning as an unofficial representative of federal authority, had drafted documents that would formalize the protection of Thorne Station once the immediate threat was neutralized. Eli had departed hours earlier with specific instructions and a letter bearing Madeline's signature, a contingency plan that would activate only if events in Salvation's End unfolded differently than anticipated. As the eastern sky brightened, with the promise of another scorching day, Madeline emerged from the main house, transformed for the confrontation ahead. Gone were the practical work clothes of the previous day. Instead, she wore a riding outfit of deep indigo, tailored to allow freedom of movement while presenting a formal appearance appropriate for what was, in essence, a declaration of war cloaked in the guise of business negotiation. The thorn rose, rested in a custom holster at her hip, its ornate grip partially visible against the dark fabric of her skirt. A second standard revolver was concealed beneath the short jacket she wore against the morning chill. Her copper-streaked hair was arranged in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, practical rather than decorative. "The men are ready," Vernon reported as she mounted the silver-grey mare that had been groomed to a gleaming sheen. "Everyone understands their role and the signals to watch for." Madeline nodded, settling into the saddle with the ease of someone who had spent more of her life on horseback than off. "And our unexpected guest?" "Sullivan's position is secured at the agreed location. He'll move when the signal comes." She surveyed the assembled ranch hands, men who had worked Thornland for years, who had respected Marcus and now stood ready to defend his legacy despite the overwhelming odds arrayed against them. Their loyalty was not to abstract concepts of property or wealth, but to the concrete reality of what the Thorn name represented in a territory where honor often seemed in short supply. "Bishop believes I'm coming to surrender," she told them, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "He expects a broken woman, prepared to sign away everything to save her own life." A grim smile touched her lips, transforming her features from merely composed to formidably determined. "His disappointment will be profound." As she turned her mare toward the trail that led to Salvation's End, the rising sun caught the silver inlay of the thorn rose, sending a momentary flash of light across the yard, like lightning captured in metal, a harbinger of the storm about to break over Everett Bishop and the powerful interests he served. The hour of warning shots had passed. Now came the reckoning. Salvation's End appeared transformed as Madeline approached from the eastern road, the morning sun casting long shadows across the town's weathered facades. Where normally the settlement would be stirring lazily to life, with shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks and freight wagons preparing for departure, an unnatural stillness had settled over the main street. Windows that should have been thrown open to catch the morning breeze remained shuttered. Doors that typically welcomed customers stood firmly closed, many with hastily scrawled signs announcing unexpected closures. The citizens of Salvation's End had recognized the gathering storm and chosen shelter. As Madeline guided her mare toward the center of town, she noted strategic positions that had been quietly occupied during the night, according to her instructions. The livery stable's hayloft window showed the briefest glint of sunlight on metal. Thatcher positioned with his Winchester as planned. The mercantile's roof edge revealed a shadow too angular to be architectural, McKendrick with the Sharps rifle he'd carried since his cavalry days. Other positions remained invisible to casual observation, but Madeline knew they were manned, forming a carefully orchestrated perimeter around the Golden Horseshoe Saloon where Bishop awaited her surrender. The saloon itself presented a deceptively ordinary appearance, though the number of horses tethered outside, 16 by her precise count, confirmed that Bishop had gathered significant force for this confrontation. Two men lounged with artificial casualness on the boardwalk before the swinging doors, their relaxed postures belied by the way their hands never strayed far from their holsters. Madeline reined her mare to a halt in the center of the street, directly opposite the saloon. The position was carefully chosen, far enough to provide reaction time if needed, close enough that conversation could be conducted without shouting, and precisely aligned with the sun at her back, ensuring anyone emerging from the saloon's relative darkness would be momentarily disadvantaged by the glare. One of the men on the boardwalk straightened, squinting against the light. "Mrs. Thorne," he called with forced joviality, "you're expected inside." "I'm precisely where I intend to be, Mr. Reynolds," Madeline replied, addressing the man by name, though they had never been formally introduced. The small gesture, demonstrating knowledge he hadn't realized she possessed, caused a momentary flicker of uncertainty across his features. "Please inform Mr. Bishop that if he wishes to conclude our business, he'll join me here." The man hesitated, glancing at his companion, who shrugged with exaggerated indifference. After a moment's indecision, Reynolds disappeared through the saloon doors, leaving his partner to maintain unconvincing nonchalance on the boardwalk. The doors swung open again almost immediately. Everett Bishop emerged into the sunlight momentarily, raising a hand to shield his eyes against the glare. He had dressed for what he clearly anticipated as a triumphant occasion, a fresh black coat over an embroidered vest, his hat adorned with a new silver band, his boots polished to a mirror. Shine. The effect was theatrical rather than impressive, the costume of a man playing a role rather than authentically inhabiting it. "Mrs. Thorne," he greeted her, stepping fully onto the boardwalk. "I see you've decided to be difficult, even in surrender." "You mistake my purpose, Mr. Bishop," Madeline replied, making no move to dismount. "I've come to clarify terms, not to surrender anything." Bishop's practiced smile faltered momentarily before reasserting itself with increased wattage. "Terms were outlined quite clearly yesterday. Thorne Station transfers to new ownership. You receive compensation substantial enough to establish yourself comfortably elsewhere. Everyone benefits. Everyone except my husband, whose murder preceded this generous offer. The accusation, delivered in the same conversational tone one might use to discuss the weather, landed with visible impact. Bishop's smile vanished entirely, replaced by the cold calculation that more accurately reflected his nature. "Careful with your accusations, Mrs. Thorne," he said softly. "They might be considered slanderous by those who ruled your husband's death an unfortunate accident." "I have new evidence suggesting otherwise," Madeline countered. "Evidence that would interest the federal authorities." For the first time, genuine alarm flickered across Bishop's features. Before he could respond, the saloon doors swung open, again disgorging Hollis and 4 more men who positioned themselves in a loose semicircle around their leader. From within the shadowed interior, additional figures could be glimpsed moving into strategic positions near windows and the side exit. "This grows tiresome," Bishop declared, his voice hardening as he recognized the confrontation wasn't proceeding according to his script. "You're outnumbered and surrounded, Mrs. Thorne. Your ranch has been searched, your hands neutralized, your options exhausted. There is only one sensible course available." "And yet," Madeline observed with calm detachment, "you seem increasingly concerned for a man holding all the advantages." As if summoned by her words, the distinctive sound of a railcar door opening and closing echoed from the direction of the depot at the far end of the street. Bishop's head turned reflexively toward the noise, confirmation that whoever occupied the private car Eli had reported was indeed connected to the current confrontation. A figure emerged from between buildings, a man of late middle age, impeccably attired in Eastern fashion that appeared jarringly out of place on the dusty frontier street. His silver hair and neatly trimmed beard framed aristocratic features that bore the confidence of someone accustomed to wielding power rather than merely projecting its appearance. He walked with the measured pace of a man who expected the world to adjust to his timeline rather than feeling compelled to hurry for anyone else's convenience. Harrison Beaumont, Madeline identified him without needing introduction. Railroad magnate, oil speculator, and architect of at least 3 territorial governors' careers. The newcomer paused, genuine surprise registering on his otherwise composed features. "You have me at a disadvantage, madam," he replied, his Boston accent incongruous against the backdrop of the frontier town. "A novel experience for you, I imagine," Madeline observed, "though not as novel as discovering federal agents have been. Investigating your acquisition methods across 3 territories." Beaumont's expression shifted from surprise to calculation, his gaze moving from Madeline to Bishop with growing displeasure. "You assured me this matter was resolved," he said to Bishop, making no attempt to lower his voice or conceal the relationship between them. Bishop's composure cracked visibly. "It will be," he insisted, gesturing sharply to Hollis, who moved his hand toward his holster with deliberate menace. "I wouldn't," Madeline advised, making no move toward her own weapon, but shifting her position slightly in the saddle. "Your men are current targets from at least 6 positions surrounding this street. The first hostile action will trigger a response that would make even your considerable resources insufficient to manage the consequences." As if confirming her statement, sunlight glinted briefly from the mercantile roof, McKendrick signaling his readiness. Another flash came from the church steeple, where Eli had positioned himself before dawn. The livery stable's hayloft window revealed the unmistakable profile of a rifle barrel. Beaumont, veteran of corporate warfare, where identifying leverage constituted the difference between success and ruin, recognized the shift in power dynamics immediately. His gaze settled on Madeline with new assessment, seeing beyond the widow to the strategist who had orchestrated this confrontation. "Perhaps we've proceeded with unnecessary haste," he suggested, the hint of a diplomat emerging from beneath the ruthless businessman. "These matters can surely be resolved with proper negotiation." "They already have been," Madeline replied. "Marcus concluded those negotiations before his death." She withdrew a folded document from her saddlebag, holding it where both men could see the federal seal clearly visible on the exposed portion. "The United States Geological Survey has established a formal interest in the resources beneath Thorn Station. The property and its mineral rights are now under federal protection, with development to proceed according to terms already established by my husband." Bishop's hand moved toward his holster, driven by the desperate recognition that his promised triumph was evaporating before his eyes. "You're bluffing," he snarled. "There's no federal agent within 100 miles of this backwater." "I'm standing precisely 53 feet behind you, Mr. Bishop," a voice called from the alley beside the saloon. Lawrence Sullivan emerged, his credentials displayed prominently on his coat, a federal marshal's badge now pinned beside them. "Special Envoy Sullivan, United States Geological Survey, currently enjoying the protection of U.S. Marshal James Hargrove." A second figure materialized from the shadowed alley, a tall man with the unmistakable bearing of frontier law enforcement, the territorial marshal's star gleaming on his chest. The family resemblance between him and Madeline was subtle but undeniable. The same amber eyes, the same composed expression in the face of danger. "That would be my brother," Madeline explained to the visibly stunned Bishop. "The message I dispatched last night found him considerably closer than you might have expected." Beaumont, recognizing a battlefield lost before the first shot had been fired, began a strategic withdrawal. "Mr. Bishop appears to have exceeded his instructions," he offered, the quick calculation of potential consequences evident in his careful choice of words. "I assure you, had I been aware of federal interest in the property—" "Save your assurances for the federal prosecutor," Marshal Hargrove interrupted, his tone suggesting he had heard similar protestations from powerful men before. "I have sworn." Statements from 3 of Bishop's men detailing your direct orders regarding Marcus Thorne's accident and the subsequent pressure on his widow. For a suspended moment, the tableau held, Madeline steady on her silver mare, Bishop and his men frozen in the recognition of their vulnerability, Beaumont calculating his diminishing options for escape, the federal representatives positioned to intercept any attempt at flight. The stillness shattered as Bishop made his desperate gamble. With a speed born of survival instinct, he drew and fired in a single fluid motion, his bullet kicking up dust mere inches from Madeline's mare. The animal shied, but didn't bolt, testament to its training and Madeline's firm control. Before Bishop, could adjust his aim for a second shot, Madeline drew the thorn rose. Her movement contained neither hurry nor hesitation, just the precise economy of motion that Marcus had helped her perfect over years of practice. The revolver cleared its holster and fired in what appeared to be a single action, the report echoing between the buildings with bell-like clarity. Bishop's gun flew from his hand, blood spraying from his knuckles where the bullet had struck with surgical precision, disabling without killing, inflicting maximum pain while eliminating threat. He staggered backward with a howl of agony, clutching his ruined hand against his chest. That, Madeline informed him with perfect composure, was the final warning shot. The thorn rose remained steady, now aimed at the center of Bishop's chest. The next will be considerably less forgiving. Hollis and the other men, who had begun to reach for their weapons during Bishop's attack, froze in place, each understanding with sudden clarity that the woman before them could have easily chosen a more lethal target for her first shot. There, bravado evaporated in the face of demonstrable skill that rendered their numerical advantage meaningless. "Weapons on the ground," Marshal Hargrove ordered, his own revolver trained on Beaumont. "Slowly and with appropriate care for your continued well-being." As the clatter of discarded firearms filled the street, Sullivan stepped forward with official documents already prepared for the occasion. "Everett Bishop, Harrison Beaumont, you are hereby detained under federal authority pending investigation into charges including conspiracy, fraud, attempted seizure of federally protected resources, and the murder of Marcus Thorne." Madeline watched dispassionately as her brother methodically secured the prisoners, relief conspicuously absent from her expression. Vindication provided little comfort against the reality of Marcus's absence. Justice, a poor substitute for all that had been lost. Yet as the tension of imminent violence dissipated, leaving only the clinical process of law enforcement in its wake, she felt Marcus's presence more tangibly than at any moment since his death. The thorn rose had delivered its message with characteristic precision. The warning shots were complete. What remained was rebuilding, both the physical damage to Thorne Station and the future Marcus had envisioned for the land they had shared. As Marshal Hargrove led the subdued prisoners toward the jailhouse, Madeline caught her brother's eye. The silent communication that passed between them contained volumes: shared grief for Marcus, whom James had considered a brother, acknowledgement of what she had accomplished in his absence, and recognition that while this chapter concluded, the story of Thorne Station would continue under her steady hand. Beaumont, even in defeat, couldn't resist a final observation as he was led past her position. "You're wasted on this frontier, Mrs. Thorne," he remarked, genuine admiration coloring his tone despite his circumstances. "With your strategic mind and particular talents, you could command a fortune in more civilized settings." Madeline regarded him with the detached interest one might accord an unusual specimen. "You mistake precision for ambition, Mr. Beaumont," she replied. "I have exactly what I desire. The legacy Marcus and I built together, secured against those who mistake. Power for right." She holstered the thorn rose with the same fluid grace that characterized all her movements, then turned her mare toward the eastern road and Thorne Station beyond, not as its defender in crisis, but as its rightful steward for the future that Marcus had foreseen. The warning shots were finished, the legacy endured. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.